There is a moment, usually late at night, when the room goes quiet, and you can feel how much of your life has been spent listening for someone else's mood. Not even their words, their tone, their delay, their silence. The tiny shifts in atmosphere that told you whether it was safe to breathe, safe to speak, safe to hope. And if you are an empath, you know that kind of waiting does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like being patient. Sometimes it looks like love. Sometimes it looks like understanding. But inside, it feels like standing in a doorway with your hands still on the knob, waiting for a room to decide whether you are allowed to enter. At some point, the waiting becomes heavier than the relationship itself. You start to notice that your body is tired before your mind is. Your shoulders tighten when the phone lights up. Your stomach drops when a message stays unread. Your whole nervous system learns the shape of another person's unpredictability. And the strangest part is that you keep calling this care. You keep calling it loyalty. You keep telling yourself that if you can just be more patient, more compassionate, more steady, then the tension will finally soften. But this is where the deeper truth begins. Because what looks like compassion can slowly become self-erasure. What looks like kindness can become a contract you never agreed to. And what looks like love can become a way of staying available to someone who is not actually meeting you. This is the place where many empaths get trapped. Not because they are weak, not because they are foolish, but because they have a particular gift that can become dangerous when it is not protected. They can feel what is not spoken. They can sense pain before it is named. They can intuit the fracture in someone else's face, the bruise in their silence, the loneliness hidden behind arrogance. And when that gift is mixed with old fear, old hope, old hunger for harmony, it can turn into a kind of emotional labor that never ends. You begin carrying what was never yours. You carry the other person's frustration, their confusion, their shame, their bad days, their coldness, their need to be soothed without ever learning how to soothe themselves. You become the translator for moods that should have been owned by the person producing them. You become the soft place where everything lands. And over time, your softness stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a duty. That is often the first sign that the dynamic has become unhealthy. Not because you stopped caring, but because caring stopped coming back to you as care. Carl Jung would have understood something very important here. When a person repeatedly enters a role, that role can harden into a persona. A persona is the face we wear to survive, the social self we present so we can belong. For the empath, the persona is often the good one, the understanding one, the one who can take it, the one who stays calm, the one who explains, forgives, absorbs, and waits. On the surface, that persona looks noble, but if it grows too strong, it becomes a cage. Because once you are known as the one who always understands, people stop asking whether you are understood. Once you are known as the one who always forgives, people stop fearing the cost of hurting you. Once you are known as the one who always stays, you become easier to take for granted. And if you have been living in that role for a long time, the thought of leaving can feel almost immoral. That is the trap. The guilt is so immediate that you confuse it with conscience. You think, if I step back, I am cruel. If I stop answering, I am abandoning them. If I choose myself, I am becoming cold. But guilt is not always a moral signal. Sometimes guilt is just the sound of an old pattern losing access to you. This is why the first boundary often feels like betrayal. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because your nervous system has been trained to equate self-protection with danger. The moment you stop over-explaining, the moment you stop rescuing, the moment you stop chasing emotional clarity from someone who keeps you in confusion, something inside you starts to shake. That shake is not proof that you are becoming heartless. It is proof that you are stepping out of a script that once kept you attached. And that script is often built around projection. Projection is one of Jung's most useful ideas, and one of the most painful to face. It means we do not only see the other person as they are, we also see what our unconscious has placed onto them. Sometimes we project goodness onto someone because we need them to be safe. Sometimes we project woundedness onto them because we want to rescue what we could not rescue in ourselves. Sometimes we project the image of the lost child, the broken parent, the unreachable lover, the person who will finally make our effort mean something. The empath is especially vulnerable to this because empathy can blur into fantasy when the heart is desperate for coherence. You see a person's pain, and instead of simply witnessing it, you start building a story around it. You tell yourself they are difficult because they were hurt. They are distant because they are afraid. They are harsh because they don't know how to be soft. And sometimes that is true. Human beings are complicated. People do carry wounds. People do defend themselves badly. But the danger comes when you use their wound to excuse your own disappearance. Because then you are no longer relating to the person in front of you. You are relating to the wounded image you have built around them. And that image can become a kind of emotional religion. You keep believing that if you love them correctly, they will become the version of themselves you can finally rest beside. You keep believing that if you stay gentle enough, they will stop needing to wound. You keep believing that your patience is what will redeem the connection. But your patience cannot replace their responsibility. Your empathy cannot do the work of their conscience. Your care cannot heal a pattern that is fed by control, inconsistency, or emotional manipulation. This is where many empaths begin to feel ashamed, because they realize they have been loyal to suffering for longer than they have been loyal to themselves. They stayed after the first disrespect. They answered after the first cold withdrawal. They explained after the first accusation. They made excuses after the first lie. And each time they did, they were not just forgiving the other person. They were also teaching their own psyche that discomfort is normal, that overfunctioning is love, that being drained is simply what closeness feels like. That lesson goes deep. It becomes body memory. Your body begins to anticipate tension before your mind can name it. You start scanning faces for danger. You can walk into a room and know, almost instantly, whether you are about to be used as a container for someone else's mood. That hyper-awareness is not a personality flaw. It is a survival adaptation. But survival adaptations are expensive. They keep you alive while quietly taking your life from you. And this is the point where the empath often feels something that is misunderstood by everyone around them. Exhaustion that looks like coldness. People notice that you have gone quiet and call it distance. They notice that you no longer rush to comfort them and call it changed. They notice that you no longer explain yourself and call it attitude. But what they are really seeing is that your inner resources are no longer freely available to a pattern that has been taking without replenishing. That shift can feel shocking, even to you, because the part of you that always gave is not simply a habit. It is often tied to a complex. A complex is an emotionally charged knot in the psyche, usually formed around old experiences that never fully resolved. For many empaths, there is a rescuer complex. Underneath the kindness is a hidden belief. If I can be good enough, steady enough, useful enough, then I will finally be safe, valued, chosen, or left in peace. That belief can shape entire relationships. It can make you tolerate too much. It can make you confuse intensity with intimacy. It can make you stay longer than your spirit wants to stay. And when you finally begin to withdraw, the complex does not leave quietly. It sends guilt. It sends doubt. It sends memories of the times you were praised for being the one who held everything together. That is why leaving without hatred is so difficult. Hatred can feel cleaner than grief. Hatred gives you an enemy. It gives you a simple story. It says, they are bad, I am good, and now I can walk away with moral certainty. But the psyche often knows when a story is too simple, and if you force yourself into hatred just to make departure easier, you may leave the person, but carry the poison with you. Jung's idea of shadow matters here. Shadow is not just evil. It is everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The empath often has a shadow that includes anger, selfishness, suspicion, the desire to stop caring, the wish to be left alone, the wish to say no without explaining. Because those qualities were once judged as unsafe or unloving, they were pushed out of awareness. But what is rejected in the psyche does not disappear. It waits. It builds pressure. And when it finally surfaces, it can come out as resentment, numbness, or a sudden emotional hardening. That hardening is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the first honest sign that your soul is done pretending. The goal is not to become cruel. The goal is to become whole enough that you no longer need to betray yourself to remain good in your own eyes. There is a difference between open-heartedness and open access. There is a difference between compassion and collapse. There is a difference between understanding someone and becoming their emotional shelter while they continue to strike matches inside the room. And this is where the empath begins to change, not in one dramatic moment, usually in small, almost invisible ways. The reply comes later, the explanation gets shorter. The apology is no longer automatic. The urge to fix every silence begins to weaken. You start noticing how much of your energy has been spent on maintaining a connection that only feels alive when you are overextending. That moment can be heartbreaking, because you may have loved the person sincerely, you may have seen beauty in them, you may have believed in their potential, you may have recognized their pain and wanted to be a place where it did not have to keep repeating itself. There is no shame in that. The shame would be if you use their pain as a reason to abandon your own. The deeper truth is that some people are not looking for mutuality. They are looking for regulation. They want the steadiness you provide, but not the accountability that comes with being truly known. They want the comfort of your presence without the discomfort of your boundaries. And if you have been trained to be indispensable, you can mistake that for being loved. But love that requires self-erasure is not love that can hold you. This is where the final silence of the empath begins. Not the silence of punishment, not the silence of a tactic, the silence that comes after too much inner noise. The silence that arrives when your body says, I cannot keep translating myself into a language that costs me this much. And when that silence appears, the other person may suddenly seem more intense, more needy, more confused, more interested in your response than they were in your well-being. That does not mean the relationship has transformed. It often means the old supply line has been interrupted. Your attention was part of the structure. Your emotional labor was part of the structure. Your explanations, your forgiveness, your readiness to re-enter the loop, those were part of the structure. When you step back, the structure wobbles. This is why guilt often spikes right before freedom. The psyche resists the unknown. Even a painful pattern can feel safer than an empty space. Your unconscious may prefer the familiar ache to the unfamiliar peace. That is not weakness, that is conditioning. And Jung would say that individuation, the process of becoming a more whole self, often begins where the old adaptation no longer works. Individuation is not self-improvement in the shallow sense. It is the slow, sometimes painful movement toward becoming who you are beneath the role. For the empath, that often means no longer living only as the healer, the listener, the one who can endure anything. It means allowing the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, to matter more than the persona you built to survive. The self does not ask you to stay where you are diminished. The self does not ask you to keep proving your goodness to people who benefit from your doubt. The self does not ask you to keep bleeding in the name of being kind. What the self asks is quieter, more exact. It asks you to see clearly, to feel honestly, to stop confusing compassion with surrender. And if this is landing somewhere deep in you, let yourself hear it without defending against it. Your ability to understand someone else does not obligate you to remain available to what harms you. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is leave without hatred. Not because they deserve peace, because you do. The first time you try this, it may feel unnatural. You may want to send one more message, one more explanation, one more soft landing. You may want to make sure they understand why you are pulling away, as if understanding would make your departure less real. But in some dynamics, explanation becomes another way of staying. It gives the other person a bridge back into your nervous system. It keeps the door half open. And maybe that is the symbol that belongs here, the half-open door. For too long, you may have been standing in a doorway with your heart exposed, waiting for the other person to decide whether they want to come through. But a doorway is not a home. A waiting room is not a life. A half-open door can become a habit of almost connection, almost respect, almost care. And almost is one of the most exhausting forms of emotional starvation, because it keeps hope alive just enough to prevent grieving. The moment you close the door is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a quiet internal decision. I am no longer going to live with my hand on the latch. That decision can bring grief, and grief is honest. Grief says you did care. Grief says something mattered. Grief says the loss is real, even if the pattern was unhealthy. Do not rush past grief in the name of empowerment. If you do, the shadow will collect it later as bitterness. Let yourself mourn the part of you that kept believing effort would be enough. Let yourself mourn the version of the relationship that only existed in your hope. Let yourself mourn the years you spent trying to make sense of someone who may have only ever been able to meet you in fragments. Mourning is not weakness. It is the price of seeing clearly. And then, slowly, something else begins to happen. The body learns that silence can be safe. At first, silence may feel like panic. The phone stays dark, and your mind starts inventing stories. The old reflex says, check again, explain again, rescue again. But if you stay with the discomfort long enough, you may notice something underneath it. A small, almost shy sensation of space. Space where their moods used to live. Space where their emergencies used to invade. Space where your own breath can finally arrive without permission. That space is not empty. It is yours. This is where many people misunderstand the empath's withdrawal. They think it is about becoming hard. But true withdrawal is not hardness. It is differentiation. It is the ability to say, your pain is real, and it is not mine to carry. Your confusion is real, and it is not mine to solve. Your choices are real, and I do not have to keep paying for them with my peace. That is a boundary, not a wall. A boundary. A wall says, nothing gets in. A boundary says, this is where I end, and you begin. Jungian psychology is deeply interested in that distinction, because a healthy psyche is not one without contact. It is one with contact and shape. A person who cannot separate from others becomes porous, flooded, over-identified. A person who can separate without contempt becomes more real. They can love without dissolving. They can care without collapsing. They can witness without absorbing everything. That is the maturity the empath is being asked to learn. Not how to stop feeling, how to feel without surrendering the center. There is a quiet strength in that. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need revenge. It does not need to prove the other person wrong. It simply stops feeding the loop. And when the loop is not fed, the mind begins to show you what was always there. The repeated apology that never changed behavior. The warm moment followed by withdrawal. The crisis that only appeared when you tried to leave. The charm that returned when your distance became real. You may see, with painful clarity, that you were not only responding to a person, you were responding to a pattern. Patterns are powerful because they feel personal. They are not always about one villain and one victim. Often they are the meeting place of two unconscious structures. One person who needs control, reassurance, or supply. Another person who needs to be needed, useful, chosen, or spared abandonment. That is why these dynamics can last so long. They are mutually reinforcing in hidden ways. One side feeds on attention. The other side feeds on meaning. One side avoids vulnerability. The other side tries to create connection through endurance. But when the empath sees the pattern, it starts to lose its spell. Not overnight, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to make the next pause possible. Enough to make the next no less terrifying. Enough to make the next silence feel less like death and more like breathing. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. I am allowed to stop paying for love with my peace. That sentence matters because the psyche needs language. It needs a line it can return to when old guilt rises up and tries to drag you back into the familiar. The familiar will often feel like loyalty. The unfamiliar will often feel like selfishness. But over time, you begin to see how much of what you called loyalty was actually fear of being the one who leaves. Many empaths were taught, directly or indirectly, that leaving makes them bad, that holding on makes them noble, that staying through pain is proof of love. But Jung would never ask you to confuse suffering with virtue. He would ask you to notice what in you is attached to the role of the one who endures. Because sometimes, the rescuer is not only compassionate, sometimes the rescuer is avoiding their own life by managing someone else's. That is hard to admit, and yet admitting it is freeing. Because once you see the rescuer complex, you can begin to meet the deeper need beneath it. Maybe you were not only trying to save them. Maybe you were trying to save the younger part of yourself that once felt powerless, overlooked, or responsible for the emotional weather of the home. Maybe the old wound said, if I can keep everyone okay, I will not be abandoned. If I can be useful enough, I will not be left alone with my pain. That is an old bargain, and it is one you no longer have to renew. When you stop renewing it, you may feel strangely guilty at first, almost as if your body is waiting for punishment. That is the old complex speaking. But if you remain steady, something softer begins to emerge. Self-respect. Not loud self-confidence, not performance. Self-respect. The kind that makes you answer when you mean it and stay silent when silence protects your dignity. The kind that no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. The kind that can love a human being without becoming their emotional emergency room. That is what leaving without hatred looks like in real life. It looks like no longer arguing with someone's inability to meet you. It looks like no longer mistaking their confusion for your responsibility. It looks like no longer trying to extract tenderness from a system built on inconsistency. It looks like walking away without rehearsing revenge in your head. It looks like grieving what was real and releasing what was not. It looks like letting the door close gently, and then noticing that your body, which has been braced for so long, begins to unclench in small places. Your jaw, your hands, your chest, your stomach. You sleep a little deeper. You stop checking the phone as often. You stop narrating their behavior in your mind every hour. You begin to hear your own thoughts again, not just the echo of their presence. That is not emptiness. That is return. The empath who leaves without hatred does not become less loving. They become less available to distortion. They become harder to manipulate, not because they learn cruelty, but because they learn clarity. They become more able to recognize the difference between someone who is struggling and someone who is using struggle as a shield. They become more capable of compassion that does not require self-sacrifice. And that changes everything. Because once you have felt what it is like to stand in your own center, the old dynamic loses its authority. The guilt still visits, but it no longer has the final word. The longing still appears, but it no longer gets to drive. The memory still lives, but it is no longer a command. You are not here to become a colder version of yourself. You are here to become a more truthful one, a self that can say, I care, and I am leaving. A self that can say, I understand, and I will not be consumed. A self that can say, I forgive what I can forgive, and I will not return to the wound just to prove my heart is big. That is the real boundary. That is the real maturity. That is the real end of the loop. And perhaps this is the simplest test. When you imagine their reaction, do you feel pulled back into proving? Or do you feel the quiet steadiness of someone who no longer needs to justify their own peace? If it is the first, stay with the feeling without obeying it. If it is the second, you are already closer to yourself than you were before. The point was never to hate them. The point was never to win. The point was never to become the person who finally gets the last word. The point was to stop abandoning yourself in the name of understanding someone else. That is the sentence the psyche wants to learn. That is the sentence that turns pain into wisdom. That is the sentence that allows the empath to leave with a clean conscience and an unbroken heart. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Let that be the quiet truth you carry forward, not as a weapon, not as a performance, as a boundary that protects the part of you that still knows how to love without disappearing. And when the room goes quiet again, when the phone stays dark, when the doorway is no longer half open, you may notice something else waiting there. Not emptiness, not punishment, not the collapse you feared, just your own life, standing patiently on the other side of the silence, ready for you to come back.